Hello and welcome everyone. Hello to those who are new to Achates Inspires and to those who are joining us again. We're so delighted to have you with us. Today's event is hosted on Achates' YouTube channel and is first broadcast on Tuesday, the 13th of June at 1 p.m. And to those of you watching at this time, Achates colleagues are on hand to answer any questions you have via the chat function. Achates is a strategy, fundraising, organisational change and recruitment company, and over the last 10 years, we've provided provocation and inspiration to organisations and senior individuals across the cultural sector, providing expert, market disruptor and inclusive thinking across strategy, recruitment and fundraising. Since 2019, Achates Live has provided practical help and support with monthly sessions for fundraisers in the cultural sector. And as the sector continues to emerge from the pandemic and faces new challenges and opportunities, there has never been a greater need for the ability to come together and find solutions, which is why we have launched Achates Inspires this year, a new peer network for senior individuals. Achates Inspires provides a cross-arts forum for chief executives, executive directors, and other senior leaders to learn together, hearing from expert voices on new opportunities across organisation and creative development, and provides a peer learning network to pool expertise across the sector. In doing so, it will build on the art form networks that existed before or as a result of the pandemic to provide leaders with support from their peers across the art form in a cultural sector-wide platform. After 3 very successful in-person sessions earlier this year, we've moved Achates Inspires online to ensure that as many leaders as possible can engage with this network in an accessible way. We will continue to host quarterly in-person meetings, with more details of those being announced soon. So today's session will explore how we can bring a more sustainable and meaningful approach to work and well-being in our organisations, particularly focusing on how we deal with the increasing problem of extreme fatigue. We would today welcome 2 esteemed panellists, Chris Gribble, CEO of the National Centre for Writing. Chris has been the CEO of the National Centre for Writing since 2006. He led Norwich's bid to become England's first UNESCO City of Literature in 2012 and its multi-million-pound capital campaign to create a home for NCW and Norwich City of Literature at Dragon Hall in one of the city's most cherished heritage buildings. He was chair of the International Cities of Refuge Network from 2015 to May 2023, leading a network of 70 cities across Europe and globally supporting artists and writers whose freedom of expression is threatened. He sits on the board of one of the UK's leading independent poetry publishers, Carson Press, and on the Norfolk and Suffolk Cultural Board, the Norwich 2040 Cultural Compact, and the Norwich Local Cultural Education Partnership Board. Between 2020 and 2023, he led an ACE-funded programme to support and develop over 40 early career and established leaders in the cultural sector across Norfolk and Suffolk in partnership with Achates and UEA. Chris, would you mind just saying hello?
Hello, thank you very much for inviting me today. It's a real pleasure to join you.
Delighted to have you here. Thank you so much. We're also joined today by someone who all of you will, I've no doubt, know very well, Achates' very own director, Caroline McCormick, who founded this company 10 years ago. Caroline, would you mind saying hello?
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Vicki.
Pleasure. And now to the topic for today. Having led the way through COVID, new Arts Council funding rounds, and now faced with a challenging economic situation, an increasing number of cultural sector leaders are experiencing extreme fatigue. And we are seeing the impact of this at all levels of our organisations, with large swathes of our workforce making the decision to move on from the sector in the last year. Today, with Chris and Caroline, we will explore ways in which we might be able to adopt new ways of thinking, working, and being to truly address this issue of extreme fatigue. At a time when the pressure to come back better is fighting against economic, political, and social upheaval, we'll explore how we can bring more sustainability and meaning to well-being in our organisations and the wider sector. We'll explore how we can learn from recent experience and figure out ways to support our workforce, our stakeholders, and crucially, ourselves. So Chris, who has led the National Centre for Writing, will have experience of leading the organisation through these turbulent recent years and will speak of his own experience of these issues, alongside Caroline, who has worked with many of our sector leaders, many of whom I'm sure are listening today, and experienced firsthand the impact of this. So Caroline, would you mind kicking us off by setting some context to today's sessions and why we're exploring this?
Absolutely. And thanks so much, Vicki. And as you said, particular thanks to Chris for joining us today. I suppose I should start by saying there's a degree to which I feel slightly disingenuous in terms of what I'm about to say in this session, because within the last fortnight, I have moved to 4 days a week working myself. But it's the goal that's taken me, I think, more than 4 or 5 years to realise. The need to make that change in my own life has been made urgent by the fact that my husband recently turned 70, and there is nothing like a significant birthday to make you realise the value of really active time with those you love. But it's also felt increasingly vital in order to stop myself feeling emptied out by the events of the last 3.5 years. When COVID hit, I suppose in many ways I did feel prepared. Achates was already a very low overhead company. We've never had an office, for example. So many of the challenges in those kind of immediate costs and regards we didn't have to face. But I also had two very challenging roles before I set up Achates 10 years ago. And whilst I know I got many things wrong in those roles, they also taught me a great deal. And I suppose I really did sit down and when COVID began and sort of think, right, how am I going to draw on that experience and use it well in this time? I think in particular, I thought a great deal about what it meant to lead a team through such a period. And I really did try and consider how I could be a steady presence and provide assurance, possibly even a little fun at a time when there felt like there was nothing but uncertainty available to us. I remember making a really large sign that I put on my desk. It was sort of a foot high that just said team on it in capital letters, and tried to look at that as I was working every day. I took every piece of work we could possibly get, particularly at the beginning, perhaps even ones that we would have questioned whether we would have wanted to take on, and really just spent all those endless COVID hours we could working, supporting those we could in the sector. I have to say the team were incredible, so generous and impressive, and everyone dug really deep. So we continue to deliver what I believe was outstanding work, but also doing things like at that point, the Achates Live sessions were fortnightly. When I think about now how many of them we did in that COVID period, it's just extraordinary. And the team gave incredible support to our sister foundation as well, and things such as the conference that we organised. It was really in many ways a precursor of leading to something like Achates Inspires. So I can't compliment the team enough for all they did at that time in not only doing outstanding work, but also pro bono contribution to the sector. I'm going to say I think the outcome was mixed. I think that several of the individuals, the really key individuals who work for Achates, have made life choices that have meant they've moved on from the company. And you can only respect those decisions and be happy for people, even if they're very sad for the organisation. The company has really flourished. We've grown phenomenally in that period. And I can't help but believe that, as we've said, that just having that constancy has been really important. And one of the things I found myself saying all the time to our clients in that period, which I think I've now really realised to be true, was that organisations that knew who their audiences were and provided the support they needed would come out of COVID strongly. And I think that's been really true of us. But by the end of 2022, with pressure unabated and also at that period moving into the menopause myself, I really started to feel the toll. And I think in addition to the physical and mental stress of that period, I think I can acknowledge now that I felt really stuck in a sort of fight or flight period, constantly on, not being able to decrease the volume, decrease the temperature at any time. And I think my previous experience, particularly working in a culture and human rights organisation, had always taught me not to make a drama out of a crisis. And I think that's really important. But I think what I realised was my ability to differentiate the two was really waning. So hence my desire to step back a little bit and just pace myself as a result. Because as I know only too well, unless you tackle those issues that way, exhaustion lies. Some of the tactics I really try to employ myself, because I appreciate going to 4 days a week just isn't something that's available to everybody. And it's something I'm perhaps sure we'll talk about in a minute, Vicki. But, the tactics that I've used in my life that I know stand me in good stead throughout my career and which I try to lean into are using habit in a good way. So exercise is something that's really pivotal to me. I think that I know I'm a better person when I get out of a swimming pool in the morning than I probably was when I went in. I also know that I immediately sort of, by doing something repetitive and physical, unlock my creative self as well. I also know it stops me being at my desk at 7:30. So that's a really good thing in itself very often. So leaning into those habits being a really good thing. And I think that, simple things like going to bed at the same time every night, having the same routine definitely means that I sleep better, which I know is critical, being able to work in an intense and focused way. During COVID, my days were so intense that one of the things I started to do was write out my time plan in advance the night before so that I didn't miss anything. And so that I think it was really just that combined sense of the reward of ticking off a list combined with telling myself that I was on track, I was fulfilling a plan. And that's a habit that I've kept and I try to do every day now, just to, I think, give myself a very strong sense of calm and control in the day, and then being able to know where I could deal with things that do arise. And I find the achievement in facing down a difficult task far more rewarding than delaying it. But that's the kind of person I am. I find that structured within that other more pleasurable tasks, such as staying in touch with the team, having little calls, making sure I've got that kind of conviviality within the day. And I try to speak to my direct line reports most days. But I also know that whilst I'm not really able to take breaks in any working day as such, I try to use what I would think of as micro breaks to a really good effect. So even a minute where I just go and get the washing out of the washing machine or get a drink and look out the window. I'm really fortunate to have a small garden here in London. And when I'm really having a difficult moment, when something's quite tense, I will just go and look out. If the weather's not good, I'll go and look out the window. If the weather's a little more like it is today, I might go and just sit out there for a moment and just give myself a moment. And it's amazing that a tactic like that never really fails. But again, in this, I have to acknowledge all my privilege, how fortunate I am. And not least, Achates is my company. I have the capacity to make my own decisions, to shift to 4 days a week. And that I'm really conscious that as I'm working with our team to imagine ways in which we can support the sector and come together, we also need to be thinking with everyone about how there are different modes of tackling these challenges, which aren't just on the individual. So I hope that's a helpful introduction to me and how I've been thinking about things, Vicki.
Thank you so much, Caroline. I really appreciate you sharing that kind of journey that you went on through COVID and some of the tools that you still bring into today to deal with that. Chris, I wonder if I could just ask you a few questions now about your experiences. So obviously you've been CEO of NCW for an amazing 17 years. Your leadership has clearly been completely transformational for the organisation and those that work with it, those that engage with it. But I'm sure a role like that comes with pros and cons in terms of the toll that it takes. And I'm sure you've seen a lot of people going through lots of different things. Would you mind speaking a bit about your experience of this concept of extreme fatigue and what that's meant for you?
Absolutely. And thank you, Caroline. I thought that was really tremendously interesting and illuminating, kind of opening kind of that combination of the professional and personal. It feels really helpful to hear. I'm going to sort of approach it in a slightly different way. As you said, I've been in this role, or at least in this leadership position, for 17 years in July. When I arrived in Norwich for this job in 2006, we were called the New Writing Partnership, and in 2009 we became Writer Centre Norwich, and then in 2018 we became the National Centre for Writing. So it's felt like 3 iterations of one role, but it has been a constant presence here. In addition to that experience, I also will mention COVID and what we learned from COVID and how I personally worked in COVID, because I think it's a really interesting kind of case or an example of what I call kind of crisis fatigue, as opposed to different sorts of fatigue, which I'll talk about. But also, I want to talk a little bit about, in your introduction to me, in your very kind introduction to me, you mentioned the Collaboration Place Change program that we led, which was a leadership program for early career and emerging leaders in Norfolk and Suffolk. And there's a particular, because of COVID, we added a 3rd cohort to that group of established leaders who were at the moment in the early days of that crisis, kind of all facing some very similar problems which involved fatigue. So I'll come on to mention that as well. So going back to my kind of my experience here in Norwich and at the National Centre for Writing, as we now are, I kind of outlined 4 sorts of kind of fatigue challenges that I've faced over those years. And this is an entirely subjective description. They overlap. They're not scientific. There's no evidence. It's just from me. So, you know, if you want to challenge me and tell me that it's all a load of rubbish, I'm very open to that conversation as well. So I want to start with kind of project fatigue. There are certain projects that you take on over a durational period as a leader that can give you a real challenge around just sheer capacity to carry on delivering. I'm thinking in particular, in my case, around capital projects. And Caroline will be aware of this all too well because we worked with her and the precursor to Achates on our capital development programme in Norwich. Ultimately, when we were developing that program over a number of years, I think probably 6 or 7 years in total, from its pre-development through to its delivery, there were periods of that kind of process where I was not just leading one organisation, I was running 2 organisations. I was running an organisation that already existed and an organisation that was coming into being. And that felt like a really heavy burden at times. And there were some kind of really difficult moments in that kind of I'm going to use the J word, journey. She's slightly allergic to saying that word, but never mind, it's appropriate here. The kind of the simple weight of carrying 2 simultaneous kind of needs of an organization that had to carry on existing, carry on doing its work, and also had to rebuild itself physically and in terms of its infrastructure and in terms of its vision and mission, in terms of its understanding of itself and how it worked in the world, was tremendously extractive, I think, in the sense that it felt like it took from me a lot. And there were brilliant moments of when I would get a lot back from it, but because it ultimately nothing really was visible or nothing was publicly visible until after the project, in inverted commas, ended, it felt like it was a long period of give, and not much receive. So there's that kind of project fatigue, and it's not just limited to capital projects, it's limited to any long-term, durationally sort of extended project that kind of encompasses multiple partnerships and a significant change. There's also, I think, kind of moving on to the subject of change, a category of fatigue that I encounter in myself and in others is kind of change/uncertainty fatigue, as a degree of fatigue that's brought on in our roles by uncertainty around us. And that uncertainty can come from lots of different areas. But I think in my world, I have found it stemming from a combination of policy and strategy change at macro level within the wider sector, whether that's Arts Council, DCMS, other key stakeholders and statutory partners whose funding and influence conditions some really critical material factors about how we operate in the sector. There's a degree to which if you look, for example, on a very slightly prosaic level at the number of Secretaries of State for Culture we've had in the last 7 years, I think it's probably 8 in 7 years or something like that. The degree of uncertainty and the degree of precarity that this produces in the trickle-down effect of policy, strategy, and ultimately funding at a leadership level just becomes quite burdensome after a while. One starts to kind of lose one's will to invest as much as one would have done, to contribute as much. You start to feel a slight lack of control or a slight lack of belief that there is a shared vision for what's happening in the wider sector, and that starts to grate a little bit. So it's kind of, I don't know if it's calling change fatigue or uncertainty fatigue, but something in that area. The third kind of area of fatigue that I've thought about a lot is very much related in the current circumstances to COVID, and that's kind of crisis fatigue. And it's the fatigue brought on by a crisis. We were really lucky at NCW. We had done a lot of work in the years running up to COVID in ensuring that we were able to work online and that we had suitable platforms and capacities internally and in our stakeholder relationships to deliver work online. So we took, I think, we furloughed 14 members of staff, but only for 4 weeks, while the senior management team kind of regrouped and replanned quite intensively with the support of our board, who were magnificent. And we then brought everybody back into work at that period of time and went into full-scale digital delivery, remotely, obviously. and that was quite high impact on the organisation and on how we worked and how we managed ourselves. And again, thinking about Caroline's words, the supporting the team was always critical to how we operated and how we thought. And the senior management team were brilliant again in ensuring that the line management relationships, the check-in functions, the support that we had, and the opportunities that we tried to give the team to be together with each other virtually with no work pressures were also there as well. On a practical level, we exist in a primarily 15th century building in the middle of Norwich, which just can't be left alone for very long. So on a personal basis, I was here virtually every day when I was legally allowed to be. Obviously not when I wasn't, in case anyone's listening. But, I ended up, we had, nothing stops. There was still burst Victorian pipes in the street that happened during COVID that flooded parts of our building that needed to be managed. There was still acts of vandalism by people that we had to be coped with. I had to come in and dig the garden and mow the lawn and clear the plants and just do all of that because nothing stopped at the same time. And it's that, and that's the regularity of kind of the prosaic regularity of kind of leadership functions. When you're in the middle of a crisis, when you're kind of dealing with all sorts of forces that you know nothing about, you've still got to deal with the forces that you know very clearly about at the same time. And I think, and I'm sure we'll come back to COVID and what we've learned from that. And we've learned a huge amount as an organisation, and it has unleashed a lot of change, which we're still working through and cashing out at the moment, which we can talk about. And then the final sort of area of fatigue that I want to talk about is kind of repetition fatigue. One gets to a point after a certain period of time where you start to see the patterns in your work, in your stakeholder relationships, in the political environment around you, in the funding environment around you, and you start to see them coming around again and again, or being revisited in certain ways that you realise, oh gosh, I really welcome new ideas, but if this set of new ideas had been discussed in relationship to, e.g., what happened 8 years ago, 4 years ago, 12 years ago, I think we might have come up with a slightly better set of ideas than we're being presented with now. So at some level, I think that fatigue can be related to simply kind of being in a role where you start to see things repeating too often. And those are the kind of 4 areas I really look at. And finally, the collaboration place change issue. This was an Arts Council funded, supported by New Anglia LEP with June Achates and Norfolk and Suffolk County Council. We were working with initially 40 emerging and early career leaders across Norfolk and Suffolk. We had to reimagine the whole programme because of COVID. But also at the very same time, we suddenly realised that there was a tranche of experienced leaders in Norfolk and Suffolk who were all going through extraordinary stresses and change. And so we built an additional cohort for that leadership so we could work across the first 6 months of the COVID crisis just to share our experiences. And a lot of that was around kind of being overwhelmed, being exhausted, being sort of bereft of the social and the cultural capital that accrues when you're working with people regularly on a day-to-day basis, when you're plunged into a position of uncertainty, and thinking and talking about how that fatigue affected people and how it's continuing to affect people has been really interesting over recent years. Those are sort of my experiences. Again, in personal terms, I'm also kind of after 17 years at the end of September this year, I'll be leaving my role here and taking on a new role as CEO of the Forum Trust in Norwich, which is a charity that runs a Millennium Commission building in the centre of the city that is home to the country's busiest library, the BBC in the east, a range of retail and other outlets, and runs a year-round programme of cultural and other events and engagements. And while it's not exactly a move out of the sector, it is out of the arts sector. And it is a change that I've kind of made partly in a result to kind of some combination of those 4 areas of fatigue I've just outlined, and as well as the opportunity and excitement of working in that new role, there is an element of what I'm doing that is a response to kind of trying to take care of myself as a result of the last few years of real sort of significant effort. But that's my opening gambit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. It's so interesting. And I feel like everybody watching is going to be doing what I was doing, which is scribbling down those 4 areas of fatigue and really recognizing themselves and their own experiences in every single one. It was so beautifully summarized. So I really appreciate that. Caroline obviously mentioned some tools and techniques that she employs personally to address some of her own experiences. Do you have any that you use or that you used that you might mind sharing that have worked successfully for you?
I think it's hard to know what I think one of the interesting and slightly insidious things around fatigue is that it is not an issue that you can address and solve once. It's something that is cumulative and repetitive and that you need to kind of keep an eye on. I think that habit is hugely important. I also swim less regularly than Caroline, but I swim outdoors, which I found just really joyous. I try to run regularly. I try to eat well. I try to get enough sleep. I try to ensure that I don't check my phone too late into the evening or too early in the morning. Try and fail. And I'm much better now than I certainly was over the capital process and in COVID of not working weekends as often or as high paced as I used to do. And I think it's partly just about maintaining a set of kind of unconscious habitual level practices that kind of can support the more conscious efforts that you need to actually just take care of yourself. I don't think that's a very necessarily very helpful set of contributions, but it's kind of how I'm operating.
It's interesting though, Chris, do you sometimes feel like being a cultural leader is like being an Olympic athlete?
I think if so, it's a bit like being a decathlete. So you have to be pretty damn good at quite a lot of things, but not brilliant at any one thing necessarily. But you've got to kind of exercise and train in lots of different areas to keep going. I'm stretching the metaphor to breaking point there.
Beautifully done. Chris, do you think the sector as a whole is doing enough to address this issue that we're seeing?
I think it's not only is it a difficult question to answer, it's quite a complicated question to ask because the sector is so radically diverse and kind of undifferentiated when you kind of zoom down to anything below the macro level that it's hard to see how a sector, are we really a sector is what I might say. There are certain kind of connecting networks across the sector that and the sector as a whole is very focused on well-being. It has been very focused on well-being for a while. And it has primarily been driven by audience well-being, participant well-being, and the impact or the well-being impacts of our work for those different audiences and communities. But there is an increasing acknowledgement that kind of taking care of the staff and the organisations themselves is critically important as well. I think, however, just as kind of culture eats strategy for breakfast, so does the real need for kind of survival and kind of sustainability kind of eats well-being programs for breakfast, because when you're in it and when you've got to get through, when you've got to raise the money, when you've got to deliver the project, it gets quite hard to protect all of those areas of work that you might want to prioritize on the way through. I also think that we're kind of working against forces that are greater necessarily than some of our individual capacities to counter. And there are some very fundamental questions that we need to ask ourselves as a set of interlinking organizations and networks and art fields within this wider cultural sector if we want to really make progress on how to avoid kind of the burnout fatigue cycle.
And just to add to that, Vicki, I couldn't agree more. I think it's so interesting that I think the willingness in the sector to think about these issues has never been greater, but that perhaps the capacity to do it has perhaps never been quite so stretched. And I think in a way that itself is creating an anxiety in that the acknowledgement is there, but we're almost putting ourselves under pressure, which we don't have capacity to address. And at a moment where essentially the resources of the bodies that we work with are often very stretched. It's not universally true across the UK, but certainly in England, the Arts Council's capacity to help us think about these things is very much under pressure. And so we're in this odd moment where we haven't quite created the networks that we're probably going to need across culture to work with each other and support each other, but we're perhaps in the transition period of doing so. So yeah, I really agree with what Chris is saying there. And it's how do we move forward and complement ourselves in the good work we are doing whilst helping ourselves continue to think about what else we might do.
And it's partly about addressing the opportunity cost that exists to pursue kind of both the wellbeing agenda and the kind of solutions to some of the burnout and fatigue issues at leadership level, at the same time as being subject to kind of falling revenue, falling kind of income from stakeholders and funders, increased pressure on our programs of work to deliver against social care agendas, education agendas, literacy agendas, at the same time as, thinking about the artists that we work with and our boards. There's a really crowded priority agenda there, and sometimes it's very hard to maintain and hold any space.
Yeah, I completely agreed.
It's interesting, isn't it, when we start talking about these things, because I feel recently, as you said, Caroline, there is the kind of desire and the kind of impetus to talk about this more than ever. But it has got me thinking, and I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on whether you think this prevalence of extreme fatigue is something that has really happened or been pushed forward as a result of the intensity of the last 3 years or so. Or do you think there's something sort of endemic in the way that the sector has always been set up that meant that in some way this was just inevitable that we were going to get here? And acknowledging that, considering us as a sector itself throws up a lot of questions, and I feel like even that should be a session in itself. But do you feel there was an inevitability there, or something that's just happened because of the last 3 years?
I think there's something, Chris, if I can jump in, I think there's something really interesting here about the shifting profile of privilege within the sector, which I hope is shifting, in the sense that in the past, the cultural sector has run on goodwill, and goodwill in terms of people working extremely long hours and perhaps for not the reward financially that they were really due. And that was running on social position, people having partners who perhaps could therefore support them earning less money, working long hours, etc. And I think it's fantastic that the social justice in terms of who is leading and working in our sector is shifting, but perhaps some of the supporting factors around it, the pay, the conditions, have not kept pace with that change, and people simply aren't able to do it. And then on top of that, as you say, I think there's been the specific situation and the acceleration of the issues as a result of COVID. So I think we were probably always heading towards this point. I think you've just got a number of factors really coming together. And we haven't really talked. I mean, obviously, Vicki, you lead our recruitment division, but, one of the really terrible things is the exodus we're seeing from the sector. And actually, people who are having to make choices are saying, I just can't do that. I can't be in that position. And I really worry about how balancing the social justice agenda within the sector will be upended by that. We're already seeing good people going as a result of just not being able to sustain that position.
Yeah, I think I would agree. I think that the cultural sector has always been, and probably to a degree always will be, driven by a vocational passion, people who are committed for a whole range of reasons to doing what they're doing. And that quite often leads to the sector being overly, or kind of in proportion, overly represented by people who are willing to kind of perhaps drop those boundaries around themselves and overcommit and be passionate to the point where they're not taking care of themselves or just kind of putting other people first or other causes first all the time. And there's kind of, in some ways, we don't want to change that because we need those people driving things in the sector, but we just need a little bit more structure around them to kind of stop the excesses happening. I think that the nature of our sector being kind of vocationally driven or passion driven is great, but I think that in combination with the COVID crisis, in combination with the cost of living crisis, in combination with effectively the stagnation of the economy over the last 9 years and the inflationary or the lack of inflationary pressure on wages around that time, has led to a little bit of a kind of a crisis point, of vortex within the sector, which has coincided with people starting to go, do you know what? The prestige of being involved in a sector is not balanced out anymore by those other things. So do you know what? We're going to go and do something else and find other things elsewhere. And I think that's when we start having to worry, when the actual joy and prestige and cultural cachet of being in the sector is not cancelling out anything else, then we start to have a problem.
And Chris, I really want to pick up on that word joy. We started doing a LinkedIn piece every month, and the one for June that will go live soon is just on exactly that topic, joy, and the sense of the loss of joy in the work. And I think it's it's something that I've really been trying to focus in on and go, where is that joy? Because it wasn't just about the parties and events. And I say that with Achates about to have its 10th birthday party. So I know I still get some joy from those moments of celebration and coming together, but just really trying to understand where that meaning in the work is, I think is so key, and drawing on that, I agree.
Just sort of picking up on that idea of joy and sort of what we might be able to do, because I think what's been so interesting so far is to hear from both of you about kind of where we're at and what you're experiencing and some of the sort of personal day-to-day things you're doing to try and help that. But obviously, as leaders, there is a responsibility to kind of go, what can we do? And I wonder if we could speak a little bit more about sort of how you're seeing things manifest with teams, colleagues, other stakeholders. It's not just our teams that are feeling this, and crucially, how you think we might start to sort of address some of these things, because I think the more we can also look ahead and try to look to that change, I think the better.
Are you happy for me to go first, Caroline? I think it's really interesting. I think that my short answer is, in terms of how we're seeing these things manifest across the teams and colleagues, etc., is that we're still finding out how it's kind of coming to the surface. Like Caroline's experience, NCW over COVID, the change in people's working patterns and experiences led to, I think, probably 3 key members of staff kind of leaving us after the end of that period, which is great for them, because they discovered that their family life and their personal lives were really much better suited to permanently working from home, and they found opportunities and jobs in which they could pretty much manage that, and that's wonderful for them. But that sectoral change is still sort of kind of shaking out. We had lots of talk about the Great Resignation, and it was a useful concept in as much as it alerted people to the fact that there was something different about the connected nature of people leaving the sector at that point, but perhaps not so useful in the sense that I think that it made it sound like a one-off temporary event, whereas I think that it's a much more considered slow burn process that is still happening across our sector, and we're losing a lot of people. But also, losing a lot of people is only one half of the equation. We also then have to cope with the fact that losing a larger number of people than usual at any one point means that new people are coming in altogether, and that there's an issue around support for those people. There's building experience and resilience for those people. We all know that not every appointment works out for the best, and if you have a high number of appointments, then there's going to be a higher percentage of not things not working out. So there's that to think about as well. I think that from my point of view, there's something very fundamental about in a conversation around expectations, that to try and diffuse some of this kind of anxiety, fatigue, stress and burnout. It's around trying to diffuse oh my God, how are we going to achieve all of that on these resources, into a conversation with our partners going, okay, how can you help us kind of ensure that we deliver as best we can on the resources if we got that, but we're not going to break at the end of it, and how we have that kind of slightly more adult conversation and the expectations around finances, around delivery, around partnerships, and around capacity, when we're all kind of running a bit on fumes still.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think that point's so well made. One of the hopeful things I see coming out of this is really the opportunity for partnership and collaboration. I think I mentioned in the last Achates Inspires, I've been doing some work in Ireland, and one of the things that I found really positive, obviously Ireland's in a very different place from England and Scotland and Wales economically, is a sense of collaboration in the sector. So talking about specific priority audience groups with one of our clients, and this sense of, oh, well, we'd like to partner with these other cultural organisations to think about how we could build an offer coherently as a city, as part of the Irish offer for that particular audience segment. And I found that really exciting. I've not really had that as yet. And yeah, really inspiring to hear that. And then taking on Chris's points about new people coming into the sector, and particularly in thinking about new leaders, I guess what I'm really becoming conscious of is each individual is probably much more aware than they were prior to COVID, what their personal limits, what their boundaries are. So there's that really important sense of understanding each individual as an individual, and just being clear with them, how you can work together, and that flexibility. Vicki, I know when you're recruiting, that openness as an employer, it makes you so attractive as an employer, that sense of there is room for you to be an individual within that organisational culture, and that negotiation being so clear. And one of the things that's really struck me is, I think for about 18 months now, arts workers, all jobs has been on the list of skill shortage professions in the UK that refugees and asylum seekers can apply for as once they have the right to work. To notice that, I think about 9 months ago now, that artists all kinds went onto that list, just tells us about some of those issues that Chris is referring to, and how challenging things are, albeit at 20% of a very low wage, 20% off an already very low wage for asylum seekers applying for those roles. I think it really tells us about the very, very rapid change that's going on in the sector, and the need for that kind of support that Chris is talking about. And, bringing people into an organisation only being the beginning. There really is often culture change, support that really needs to go on alongside that recruitment. So it's just a much more tailored and in-depth process than perhaps the way we've operated in the past, of saying this is the organisational culture, this is the way things are going to be, you're going to join in that way.
Yeah, I think 2 points kind of following up from that. I think on the latter point around kind of the artist roles kind of hitting that government list is an indication, it's an ugly term, but it's an indication of market failure that has been actually provoked by the policy that we're working in. It's not being solved by it, it's being provoked by it. And that is the challenge that we've got to face. And there's no sign of that kind of challenge being really met internally. Given that we are 18 months away or so for a general election, I do think it's unlikely that there'll be a policy environment that emerges in that period to really address that. So I'm not feeling terribly hopeful about that, I'm afraid. Secondly, the partnerships thing is critical. I would also add, specifically from within my kind of universe of where we are, the Arts Council England is our main funder, and we work very closely with the National Portfolio Organisation system. The rush to partnerships in priority places and levelling up for culture places is sort of drowning out kind of some of the other opportunities for real partnership work, because we are trying to match the priority of that core funder, and not just the core funder, because the Arts Council are not imposing it for no reason. They're doing it in response to DCMS and the levelling up agenda, which has somewhat evaporated recently, but who knows what will happen in the next 18 months. But it's not a very helpful set of pressures, and it's obscuring more beneficial partnerships on a more organic place base. And the Arts Council are very good at talking about place-based working. However, the fact is that all work is always already taking place in a place, because we are, funnily enough, all in places. It's almost like we've been doing it anyway. Enough.
Yeah, no, completely agreed.
I wonder if we can think about sort of other sectors we might kind of learn from, or if there's anything kind of going on that might be worth considering. Because I think, a lot of sectors are trialing some things to do this, except for the biggest, probably most public example recently has been the big 4-day work week trial that happened last year, where 60 companies across a whole range of sectors trialed it for, I think it was 6 months, and at the end of that, ended in December 22, and 90% of participants have decided to keep it on. Productivity levels were maintained, staff retention and wellbeing improved. I think they saw something like a 65% reduction in sick days and a 71% reporting from employees of lower levels of fatigue, but business revenue largely remained the same. I wondered what your thoughts were as to whether that's something that you think within the cultural sector, but also specifically the areas of it that you have experience in, might work, and what factors would need to be considered should we want to think about bringing something like that into play.
Chris, you want to go first, because you're real cultural sector as opposed to us being support cultural sector, I suppose.
I'm not certain that boundary holds very well on examination. It's all part of the same ecology. But yes, I'm happy to. So two-part answer. I think I come from a background of cultural strategy and general wonkishness, so I like to look at data. And I think if you go to the the What Works Centre for Wellbeing, who made a response to the 4-day working study. You'll find a really interesting set of questions about the general validity and robustness of that study that devolve around the lack of counterfactual study, the fact that it's not an independent evaluation, the fact that the outcome measures that they use are unclear and not reported, and that there's a lack of statistical clarity in what they actually produce in that report. So while the top level reports about how that worked look really shiny and lovely, I think and the concept of a 4-day week and reduced hours is absolutely worth exploring for all of us. That particular study, I think, just needs to be viewed quite skeptically. Secondly, I think that coming back to the question of what our sector is once you sort of start sifting out the differences in our sector, it becomes really apparent how 4-day a week working just would not work for a large proportion of our sector. And particularly if we include freelancers in that sector, who are a hugely important part of the work that we do, the concept for them of a 4-day week would just be kind of laughable, in the sense that their work supply and their work patterns around a freelancer just wouldn't militate for that sort of, wouldn't cope with that sort of structured approach. For venues and for other organisations that are genuinely focused on the communities that they work with, it might be fine just to stop to constrict working on 1 day a week, but it doesn't answer the needs that their work is doing with those communities. So it gets very complicated, and it might be that you end up, if you were to do that kind of fully consciously, you might end up encroaching on the weekend time of your staff to deliver extra work rather than during the week to suit your audiences and communities, and that's a competing set of rights there and then to think about. I'm all in favour, genuinely all in favour of looking at flexible working, of thinking about productivity across a period of time rather than across a week or a month. And I think that we should all kind of really take cognizance of the latest developments and ways of working, particularly remote working and the digital capacity that's been sort of accelerated through the COVID experience. But I'm slightly kind of cynical about a wholesale change of approach for the sector as a whole on this particular basis.
Like Chris, I've spent some time looking at that study. I think it's really interesting. I have to say, when it first came out, the fact that the Wellcome Trust were one of the big leaders of it did make me think, well, you know, that's all right for the Wellcome Trust. They're the biggest charity in the UK. And obviously for a company like Achates, where time and insight is fundamentally our product, it doesn't work. It doesn't make any sense. However, do we all implicitly know that an idea of 4 day a week? Yeah, sure, absolutely. Here I am now going 4 days a week. I'm doing it for a reason, because I think it might work for me. I think that we all know there's value in that, but we have to look at the practicalities, as Chris very rightly says. I think that what I'm slightly nervous of, like Chris, is blunt edge tools. So, you know, the idea equally that the Labour Party have said that they might bring in working practices that are quite aligned to those in France, where you can't contact people outside of work hours, etc. Essentially, I think there's general things in these ideas that are good and right. But, you know, yesterday at Achates, we had a situation where we had to mobilize ourselves very quickly in response to a client's need. And I was just thinking, well, if I couldn't contact my team member to do that in advance of the working day because there was a very particular need and situation, how would we deal with that situation? Our service and our ability to respond would be much less. And of course, I would never contact that team member outside of working hours normally. But I think there's just a bit of individual responsibility, practicality, just pragmatism that comes into these things, as opposed to reverting to absolute positions, which are perhaps a little bit idealized and a little bit blunt-edged, as I say, as a result.
Yeah, I think that you know, my perspective is that of a small organisation as well, and I think that our power kind of lies within how we choose ourselves as a team to set our boundaries, and how we ensure that we listen to all the people on the team when those boundaries are being discussed, and also how we then choose to, or how we then decide what we want to do with the resources that we've got. And balancing that, you know, thinking about what Caroline said about the early days of COVID, when you were pitching for all and every piece of work. And we've all been through, organisations have all been through periods where we just need to get work in, we need to get funding and we need to get partnerships in. And sometimes you just got to sit back and think, okay, well, let's have a look at the opportunity cost, and let's have a look at the the kind of the longer term balance of whether this piece of work is going to benefit us as an organisation on not just the financial level, but also the cultural level and the kind of the level of capacity and morale.
I think that's so important to consider the kind of role and the importance of trust and culture setting from a leader's perspective, as opposed to, as you refer to it, Caroline, kind of blunt-edged tools, and what that kind of looks like. Just sort of want to bring us to our final question, which is quite sad for me because I feel like I could dig into this with you both for hours and hours. So I'm going to try and end us on a slightly more positive note in terms of how we can realistically address these issues and move forward. So I wonder if you both could just give us a sense of what changes you think or that you would like to see to bring about a more sustainable approach to wellbeing in your organisations in this sector in general. Caroline, would you like to go first?
Sure, absolutely. I think the first thing to say is I think this is both a board and a staff responsibility. I also think, and perhaps it's a topic for another Achates Inspires, Vicki, that there is a challenge coming ahead in terms of boards. Chris has referred to the challenge in terms of recruitment for boards, and actually boards are being asked to take on so much now that there is another issue there. But I think there is that sense of it being on the agenda, the sense of it being built into the culture of an organisation. I think that we have really learned to talk about mental health, well-being, to talk about these things openly. So for me, it's very much about it being part of the culture of an organisation, building networks and sharing opportunities and resources together. And so it becomes an ongoing cultural issue as opposed to a short-term challenge. But I think there's also something very much in terms of particularly leadership at all levels, support for individuals when they come into an organisation, and rather than just assuming that one individual is going to cure or change an organisation.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think that the kind of the well-being and fatigue issue kind of it plays out across governance of an organisation in a different way as to the leadership, and again in a different way to the team as well. And I think focusing on the leadership issue, I wonder whether there is something useful to be done around perhaps challenging some of the current leadership models that exist in our sector and some of the more traditional approaches to leadership. I don't want to kind of, I think that there's just an opportunity to change how we might configure the role of the leader within our sector in a slightly more networked, more place-based, more partnership-driven way, and not rely so much on this really kind of values-focused sort of aspirational model that is quite dominant in our sector at the moment. I think that boards do play a really interesting role in this process. I think that looking at the expansion of the national portfolio from Arts Council's point of view, it's bringing in a wider range of organisations and a lot of newer organisations. I think there's some really interesting opportunity for learning across the sector about what the extant organisations who've been in the portfolio for a while can learn from those different models coming in from outside the kind of the traditional arts sector, and vice versa. Of course, it goes both ways. And then in terms of staff and team, I think it's around kind of ongoing, honest conversations, shared priority setting, boundary drawing within the organisation, and kind of being clear about the organisational values in terms of how they play out in the day-to-day line management.
Thank you so much. So beautifully summarised there at the end, Chris. So this just falls to me now to say a huge thank you to Caroline and to Chris for joining us today and sharing such personal and professional and kind of wide-reaching insights into this really complicated but really important topic that we're all experiencing. Thank you to those of you that are joining us today. If you are watching on the 13th of June, a colleague from the team will stay on the chat for the next 10 minutes to answer answer any questions or thoughts that you want to share with us. So please do. We love to hear from you. And just a reminder that here at Achates, we offer a range of strategy support from business planning to feasibilities. As Caroline mentioned, we offer recruitment support. So whether that's development positions, CEO, trustee roles, and also organisational change support to help you transform your boards and teams, whether that's through new hires, development of and support of existing teams, as well as obviously our fundraising support. So if there's anything we can do to help, please do get in touch. The next Achates Inspires will take place next month in July. It will be online. So please keep an eye on your inboxes where the topic will be revealed very soon. So thank you so much and look forward to seeing you soon.
Thanks so much,
Thanks
Vicki.
so much. Thank you.
And Chris, thank you for today, and congratulations all you've achieved at National Centre for Writing, but I know we're going to have a chance to celebrate that before too long.